If you look at modern culture online, it is increasingly predictable. The same groups of people are getting outraged by the same kinds of things every day. Identical reactions, identical phrases, identical certainties. The writer Gurwinder states, "It's getting ever harder to distinguish humans from bots, not just because bots are becoming more human-like, but also because humans are becoming more bot-like." The term non-player character was invented to describe characters in a video game controlled by the computer with no autonomy. But now we use it to refer to real people who live their life following a script with predictable responses and engaging in seamlessly mindless automated behaviors. Of course, we can see them all around us. Our political opponents are clearly NPCs, or a colleague who is always convinced of the latest conspiracy theory, not in control of their life and their emotions, being controlled by the media they consume. But what's incredibly hard to see is our own lack of autonomy and how our own media consumption influences us. Being a non-player character, or NPC, is not about what you think or do, it's about how you determine what to think or do. And I would argue that even the wisest of us all are to some extent non-player characters. And it's completely logical. Your brain has to process around 11 million bits of information every second, but you can only consciously process about 40 bits. So what happens to the rest of the almost 11 million? Well, your brain takes shortcuts. These shortcuts are useful for survival. They helped our ancestors quickly decide if the rustle in the grass was a predator, but in today's information-saturated world, these same shortcuts might be turning us into what psychologists call cognitive misers. These are people who make decisions using incredibly simplified versions of reality. So hello and welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology podcast with me, Samuel Webster Harris. As always, we're diving into the science of self-improvement with the goal of helping you build a life well lived. Some of the most useful episodes that I've done on the show recently were an episode titled How to Build Free Will and another one about how to build intelligence. And this episode really picks up where those two left off. We're going to learn about the 5 types of non-player character and their approach or mindset towards processing information and decisions and how they build beliefs. You are going to have a lot of aha moments this episode as you recognize people around you doing these behaviors. But the real results, of course, will come from honestly examining your own behaviors and seeing where you fall into these default heuristics. And I will be completely honest with you, writing this episode, I noticed several things where I'm like, wow, I do rely on that shortcut myself to get to information. And I've genuinely felt like I've come away from this episode with some homework on how to improve my own decision making. So I'm not making this episode to pull any punches on people. I'm just doing this for our own collective wisdom. So please do stay tuned.
Amiga que tá ouvindo esse podcast, você tá na vibe de quê? Uma comedinha? Fantasia? Ou você é da aventura? Independente de qual a sua vibe, tem sempre algo novo esperando por você no Prime Video, com produções exclusivas e tudo que você ama em um só lugar. Dá pra chorar, sorrir, se aventurar ou se apaixonar. Assine já!
Now, firstly, credit where credit is due. This episode is highly inspired by the in-depth article written by Gurwinder. He called it Why You Are Probably an NPC and What to Do About It. And on the show, maybe once a month, I like to really expand on one of the best things that I have personally read and add a little extra psychology behind it. That is what I'm doing today. I will link the original article in the description if you want to do your own extra reading from Gurwinder's version. And I thought it was brilliant, and I'm delighted to expand upon the 5 main types of non-player character today. This episode will certainly help you come away with a greatly increased ability to understand modern humans and yourself. Now, before I start the episode, I want to give a fair warning that if you are emotionally political, and if you have trouble with your views being questioned, this episode might not be a good episode for you. I generally just try to steer clear from any politics these days because it's getting absolutely ridiculous. But to truly explain these non-player character types, it was very hard to do a good job about talking about some common forms of political views and how they manifest in different NPC types. And to do a good job of helping you build wisdom, I am going to have to include questioning some common and contrarian media on things like racism, vaccines, and other overly politicized stuff that we could all depoliticize a little bit so we could actually seek some more real truth upon them. So you have been warned. I will be sharing some data that might annoy anyone if they are politically inclined to the left or to the right. And now let's move on with the episode. The human brain is only 2% of your body weight, yet it devours 20% of your energy. Despite all of this work it's doing to consume all that energy, the brain is fundamentally very lazy, or better described, elegantly efficient. It has two distinct modes, as Daniel Kahneman says in his Fast and Slow Thinking book. System 1 is your brain's power-saving mode. It's fast, automatic, effortless. Then there's System 2, that's the high-performance mode, very analytical, energy-intensive, and painfully slow. And you kind of want to avoid using System 2 as much as possible if System 1 will do. It's our System 1 that helps us deal with those 11 million bits of information per second, and it does that by instantly ignoring most of it and simplifying the few things that might be useful, whilst our System 2 can pay attention only if it really has to for things that are vitally important and can't be worked out using an easier method. Of course, we like to imagine ourselves being thoughtful and analyzing each situation we encounter to come to a sensible decision, but neuroimaging studies really show that that isn't the case. If there is an easy answer presented to us, we will probably take it. A study from Yale showed that 70% of the time, we will choose an obvious answer even if it's incorrect, rather than slowing down to process it. However, if the question is presented to participants in their second language and they have to turn off their autopilot thinking and use their System 2, they're suddenly much more likely to get the trick question right because they engage their brain. Or we could think about some conditions that define modern life these days. Being tired, stressed, or overwhelmed. Well, in any of those scenarios, our prefrontal cortex slows down. That's the part of the brain that does hard stuff. And then we just rely on automated responses. So if you're ever talking about how tired or stressed you are, or maybe overwhelmed, you are probably going through life on automatic mode. In fact, our mental shortcuts get even worse when it comes to collective behaviors. If we are in a group and we conform to their opinions, our anterior cingulate cortex, which is the brain's error detection system, basically turns itself off, and we literally just agree with the group instead of thinking critically for ourselves. So I've explained these things just to give you a bit of a primer on why our modern environment, which is full of information, increasingly exploits mental shortcuts that happen in our brain. Social media algorithms, news feeds, digital entertainment, they all tap into our System 1's preference for quick automated responses. Our environment is actively engineering us to do so. Just as a programmer can't debug code that they can't see, we can't modify our own mental shortcuts until we understand them. Now, we don't need to eliminate all of these shortcuts that we take. A lot of them are essential to our functioning. But what we want to do from this episode is become more conscious of when and how we use mental shortcuts. And with that, we're now ready to learn about the 5 types of non-player character and their main shortcut pathways that they take to create beliefs. Not only will you start understanding and seeing NPCs everywhere, you will notice you have been using some of these shortcuts yourself at least sometimes and understand some of the flaws in your own belief building. So, finally, on that, number 1, we have the conformist type of NPC. The conformist is the most common form of NPC behavior. It is the automatic outsourcing of thought to the general mainstream consensus. There are some classic conformity experiments in psychology from Solomon Asch, who showed that 37% of people would deny obvious visual evidence to agree with a group. And when we look at things like brain imaging, it really helps explain why. Social agreement activates reward pathways to those triggered by food or monetary gain. We are literally wired to find consensus a pleasurable act, and it feels like it's good for us. So let's look at what a conformist does to process new information and beliefs. Firstly, they will check what is trending online. They will then align with mainstream sources, accept this consensus view as their own, and then finally start to defend this view as an established fact, even though they didn't really work out where the fact came from. What they are not doing is they are not evaluating information. Instead, they are just scanning for social alignment. They're a bit like fish that swim in schools, somehow manage to turn in perfect unison without any single fish being in charge. Now, of course, often the wisdom of crowds can be very useful, but sometimes it can be very bad. A study once investigated accuracy of witnesses picking suspects in a police lineup. What they found was the higher the unanimous agreement between witnesses, the less accurate they were. This is because the likelihood of everyone agreeing on one belief is actually very unlikely without some irrational force like social pressure making them agree, because lots of people have different perspectives on the same event and see different things. If they're all agreeing, that's because someone has a stronger voice than the others, and the group is somehow influencing itself. Now, generally speaking, science is very good, yet we do know that the sugar industry, for example, paid scientists to downplay the bad effects of sugar for decades. Other examples include an anti-racist professor faked their own research to show the United States as systemically racist, and another professor in her study on dishonesty in science research faked her own research, which certainly proved a point, but not quite the one she wanted to prove. Another issue with science and academia is that it has a very strong liberal or woke bias that over-reports oppression and climate issues, and I'm not saying they aren't issues, they are really big issues, and I certainly believe strongly that they exist. But I am saying they are over-reported. For example, there's been a 400% increase in the use of the words sexist and racist, despite there not being a clear increase in sexism or racism taking place. I'm not saying that those things don't exist, I'm saying that they haven't increased 400%, but we are talking about them a lot more. If you were to test the average liberal-leaning person, they often overestimate by a wide amount the number of police shootings of Black Americans. Now, any reasonable person who watches the news would probably expect more Black Americans are killed than white Americans. And it could be interesting for you to ask yourself how many Black people you think are killed compared to white people, perhaps even pick a number. Now, I asked some people on the street and everyone said that it was more Black people for sure. Some said probably thousands of Black people killed each year compared to hardly any white people. To be fair, if you look at the news, you don't really hear that much about white people being shot. However, on average, if you look at the actual data, every year about twice as many white Americans are shot and killed than Black Americans. If you look at the data from 2023, 499 white people were killed and 249 Black people were killed. Pretty much exactly half. Now, before you get very angry at me and say I'm not looking at the important things, yes, if you consider how many more white people there are, that means you are still actually twice as likely to get shot if you are Black. And that's bad. I would never say that there aren't some inherent problems in society. There are. I want to make that very clear that there is more danger of being shot if you are Black. I am not denying that. It is a bad thing. Agreed. I am saying that a lot of what gets amplified on the news and social media creates an impression in people's heads that there are thousands of Black people being shot every year and vastly more Black people than white people. And this idea in their head greatly angers them, even though it isn't true. And it does lack some perspective if we were to look at something else that isn't so much on the news, such as 49,000 Americans die from suicide each year. That's 200 times more people than are shot. So you're 200 times more likely to get depressed, perhaps from the media you're consuming, and commit suicide than you are to get shot by the police. And it certainly shouldn't be political to find some data that is correct and go, oh, that's some data. It's just some data. It's not offensive to people. It doesn't have a political leaning. And there's a link in the description to that data. As you know, if you listen to the podcast, I have no political agenda. I just enjoy looking at data, and I certainly don't want to downplay anyone's bad experiences with the police. Whatever race you are, we all deserve to have equal treatment, and there is work to do to improve that. But there is also work to do to improve the ideas in people's heads that there's thousands of people being killed who aren't, and if they have the ratios completely skewed in their head, they just don't understand reality, and that's just come to them from accepting mass media and not actually questioning it. Anyway, back to explaining non-player character conformist views. Of course, as I said at the start, mainstream views are often correct, but it does really pay to fully check behind them rather than just seeking confirmation of what you think is already right. The most telling sign of a conformist NPC type, however, isn't just their agreement with mainstream views, it's their discomfort with uncertainty. When evidence is unclear, they don't admit that there's doubt. Instead, they just default to whatever Wikipedia currently says or whatever they're hearing on their social media. When you look at their social media profiles, they will generally be a perfect mirror of trending causes lately and they'll be promoting whatever their platform already promotes as the consensus. Conformists will often pride themselves on being well-informed, yet they are not really following true evidence. They're following crowds. And when they do this, they become exactly what they often accuse others of being, and running a predictable social script. Now we have the next logical NPC type, the Contrarian. In their quest to avoid being a non-player character, they have programmed themselves with an equally predictable script. Whatever the accepted consensus is, think the opposite. When you research reactance theory, it shows that people, if they feel their intellectual freedom is threatened, they will often respond by adopting the contrary position. Not because they've analyzed the situation, but because opposition itself feels like freedom to them. When you look at brain imaging, you can clearly tell a contrarian when you look at their brain imaging, because when they encounter mainstream information, their threat detection system overly activates. And it does this before any of their analytical centers turn on. So instead of evaluating information, they are defending against it. The issue is, of course, this leads to a very predictable decision-making pattern. So 1, encounter mainstream position. 2, automatically reject it. 3, seek alternative explanations. And then 4, frame their opposition as independent free thinking. So if a trusted institution makes a claim, the contrarian will immediately search for reasons that it must be wrong. If experts have reached a consensus, the contrarian will instinctively suspect a conspiracy. Now, there can be benefits. Mainstream consensus certainly can often be mistaken. But contrarian skepticism isn't selective at all, it's automated. And so they become so focused on avoiding one script that they've failed to notice they're running another script. And in their quest to avoid being like a sheep, contrarians have become what they fear most. NPCs whose responses can be accurately predicted by simply inverting whatever the mainstream believes. Now, although contrarians are relatively rare, you will probably know a few because they are kind of outspoken. Unlike the conformists who often lean left and liberal, the contrarians tend to lean right, perhaps far right, and they'll spend their time more on the fringes of the internet. They might rely on mildly contrarian things like Joe Rogan or more aggressively anti-establishment sources like Russell Brand or Tucker Carlson, and they certainly will have a big leaning towards conspiracy theories. It is worth saying that conspiracy itself is hardwired into the human brain because it was, after all, safer for us to be paranoid and avoid traps than to assume safety. But with the infinite information around us these days, there is always going to be an avenue that could justify our paranoia if we want to find it, and this is really quite unhealthy and not good for contrarians. So on that, how does someone become contrarian? Well, they might start conformist and get kind of jaded by it. Let's say, for example, an accepted conformist view is that vaccines are all good and you should get your vaccines and have your child vaccinated, etc. Then this person questions a little bit why America's CDC is recommending a whopping 56 vaccines for their baby in the first 36 months. They do some research and find that vaccine approval doesn't actually require studying the dangers of having multiple vaccines mixing in the body at once. Yet there is an increased rate of issues like illnesses and allergies when a baby is given multiple different doses at once, and that kind of worries them. They hear about the high aluminium content in all vaccines. Aluminium being a toxic heavy metal that our body can filter out if we eat it, but not if we inject it. And in fact, if you look at every single vaccine, they are all over the recommended levels of aluminium regarded as safe. Now, this is a true fact, and it's actually quite worrying for anyone. And if you read more about some of the developmental problems that they can cause and some of the chronic diseases kids seem to have related to vaccines, it does get a bit worrying. Of course, I should just say, I don't believe that the MMR jab is going to give you autism like there was that whole scare. Anyway, this person then asked to give their baby 2 COVID vaccines in their first year, and they find that barely any young kids at all, let alone babies, had the slightest problem from COVID-19. And in fact, the vaccine only protects for 1 year anyway, and they wonder if their baby really needs to have these vaccines on top of all the other vaccines when they're never going to get COVID. They're also told their baby should have 3 hepatitis B vaccines, despite hepatitis B only being caught from having sex or sharing needles, which is highly unlikely for a toddler to be doing. Okay, yes, you can catch hepatitis B from a blood transfusion, but it's unlikely that the toddler will need one, and infinitely more unlikely that the blood transfusion will actually be infected. So back to the conformist view on vaccines, which is that they're good and they save lots of lives, and science is good so you don't question it. But because there's a lack of a middle ground that can question vaccines reasonably on the internet, this person investigating can get sucked into conspiracy theories about vaccines that they are all bad and they're purely some profit-making scam that's actually trying to kill people, which is a bit too contrarian and too much of a conspiracy. The thing is, these people, when they see that vaccines are genuinely promoted for profit, they feel fundamentally burned and let down by the system, and they become allergic to the mainstream consensus on all things. Now, in reality, vaccines have incredibly increased the health of the planet and even eradicated terrible diseases. But it's also reality that in America, perhaps the vaccination schedule is too much compared to Europe, and perhaps part of that is due to some capitalistic profit-making and is potentially risking some health outcomes. Now, I personally did study biology at university and was kind of shocked to realize my own conformist view here, as I assumed that all vaccines were great, and that is a bit wrong. There are clearly some health costs to vaccines. Any medical intervention that you have at all has a risk-reward balance. Vaccines are not completely a free pass with zero risk. They are, however, an incredibly useful intervention in most cases. But the idea that a vaccine could possibly have a negative impact shouldn't be a politically sensitive topic where you're either an anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorist or you just accept all vaccines. There should be a middle ground, yet instead of humanity being scientific and questioning the true safety levels of vaccines, it's politicized. Again, if this interests you, there are some links in the description. The point that I was making here was that actually there is some validity to question vaccines, but there's a lack of useful information on the internet that leads to it being very hard to actually understand what's going on, and you're much more likely to fall into conspiracy theories. And if you are someone that feels burned by the establishment, or you're prone to seeing people as evil and deliberately doing things wrong, you will very much fall into the contrarian side of things and just see evil manipulation behind all mainstream normal views. And that isn't too useful. Okay, we are going to have an advert break before we move on to the final 3 NPC types that I will get through a bit faster, trust me. Hopefully I haven't offended too many people and you haven't all tuned out already. This was definitely a difficult one, but thank you very much for sticking with me and do please stay tuned. Right, next up we have the NPC type of the Disciple. These days we have a lot of digital devotees. The Disciple represents another paradox of modern thought. Individuals who pride themselves on thinking differently whilst actually outsourcing their entire worldview to a single charismatic figure. Whether it's a tech billionaire like Elon Musk, a political leader, or a social media guru, the Disciple will have found their intellectual North Star, and then their brain is on autopilot by just following that person. When we look at psychology research into parasocial relationships, it shows that our brains can genuinely form intense emotional bonds with people that we have never met. And for disciples, these bonds become cognitive shortcuts. Instead of analyzing information, they simply ask, what would their leader think about this? Now, of course, this isn't a new way of thinking. Religions have taught us to literally think, what would Jesus do or what would the Buddha do? That really helped people live their lives and build their beliefs. But now it's becoming the same in the modern day for people who follow their cult heroes. Brain imaging shows how when a disciple encounters information from their chosen leader, their neural activity will mirror patterns seen in religious devotion. Their skepticism areas quieten down, whilst their areas associated with trust and emotional bonding will light up. So they aren't just choosing to believe, their brains are automatically accepting and they're feeling good about it and feeling close to the person that they follow. The disciples' decision-making process is, again, very predictable. Number 1, encounter some new information. Number 2, check what their leader's position is. Number 3, adopt that stance. And number 4, defend that stance as original free thinking. What's really interesting is how they deal with contradictions. So let's say their leader changes a position on something. The disciple doesn't just change their views. They will retroactively adjust their memories to believe that they always held this new position that they've only just started believing. And it's not just conscious deception, it's an automated way of updating their beliefs. Perhaps the most telling sign of a disciple's way of thinking isn't just their dedication to their leader's ideas, but their adoption of their leader's entire persona, maybe copying their speech patterns, attitudes, even their mannerisms or diet, etc. They're not just following a philosophy, they're downloading an entire personality template. And you can certainly see this for people who idolize Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, or even sometimes Donald Trump or Elon Musk. They're more like to idolize someone who shows himself as breaking away from global elites, perhaps, on average, usually people who are averting the feminization of men and holding back the collapse of Western civilization as they so claim. These leaders will often lean more right because the establishment is left liberal, and they tend to act unapologetically masculine, which is especially appealing to young men deprived of role models. Of course, there are heroes and disciples of any political spectrum. I'm just pointing out some of the more common forms of disciple-type NPCs. Now, theoretically, some of it does make sense. If you follow Warren Buffett or Elon Musk, people who make lots of money, and you use their decisions for stock investing, you could likely do quite well. But if you use their decisions for all life, it can be more dangerous. I think it's much better to replicate mental models of great thinkers than it is to replicate their exact beliefs. Sure, these heroes might be experts on some topics, but no one really these days has the time to be a complete thought leader or expert on everything. Especially if your hero runs lots of businesses or has a country to run, they likely don't have time to have a belief on everything. And they also aren't in your situation. And when we're at different situations in life, it is useful to hold different beliefs on some things. Finally, it is kind of ironic that many of the thought leaders that people follow have a brand around teaching people to think for themselves, whilst deliberately or accidentally creating armies of NPCs who automate their thinking to match their guru's output. Anyway, as we can conclude, the disciple-type NPC has the appearance of free thinking without the cognitive heavy lifting, and again, it's not a trap you want to fall into. Next, we have the Tribalist-type NPC, where our group identity automates our thinking. In an age of increasing polarization of things, the Tribalist NPC really does represent our most fundamental form of automated thinking. Tribalist NPCs are not just choosing sides, their brains are literally rewiring themselves around a group identity. And we have been tribes, of course, for 90% of human history, and naturally NPCs of any kind will morph into some form of tribalism. The benefit here is not just an easy way to form our views and take shortcuts, but also to get a sense of belonging. And the science, again, is striking. When you look at brain scans of how they make decisions, their brain will process information through entirely different neural pathways depending on whether it comes from their in-group side or their out-group side. The exact same statement, when attributed to their team, lights up reward centers in areas associated with trust. When it's attributed to the other side, it triggers regions linked to skepticism and threat detection. What makes this automation so powerful is its reward system. Research shows that agreeing with your tribe releases some dopamine, that's the same neurochemical in addictions. We're literally being rewarded, which explains why social media arguments feel so compelling to people. They're triggering really ancient neural circuits for group survival rather than navigating the difficulties of modern belief forming. So again, tribalists have a pretty predictable pattern of how they make decisions. They'll encounter new information, they'll check the general alignment of their tribe on this information. If it does align with their tribe, they'll accept it. If their tribe doesn't agree with the information, they will reject it. They then finally might share within their tribe to signal their loyalty of the fact that they believe in this information or not, depending on their tribe's views. And you can see with how tribalists process the news, they don't ask, is this piece of news true? They'll ask, does this support our side? Their social media feed becomes echo chambers, not through accident, but by design. Their brains are actively seeking the dopamine hit of tribal confirmation, so they're sharing articles with a title that they believe in without even reading stuff. And they'll certainly be sharing articles they haven't even read that just have a good title that conforms with something that their tribe believes. One of the most revealing things about a tribalist thinking isn't just the positions that they hold, but how those positions cluster. So climate change, vaccine efficacy, economic policy, they don't have any inherent connection. Yet tribalists will reliably hold all the same views as their tribe's position on all of those items. They aren't evaluating each issue independently, they are running a very tribal script to come to their conclusions of what is good and what is bad. Our wonderful modern technology does supercharge this ancient tendency that we have. Social media algorithms really create perfect echo chambers. Our recommendation systems ensure that tribalists never have to encounter genuinely opposing views, only the stupid, caricatured versions that their tribe shares. And that's why when you live in your own bubble, you can become very surprised by political outcomes that swing the other way, which obviously represent what the majority of people are looking for, but you can be completely blind to it. A thing that you'll really notice that binds tribalists is the concept that we are fighting a battle of good versus evil. And it's easy to see that you are the good guys with a heroic leader, kind members, a positive disposition, and that the opposition are a bunch of raving lunatics, heathens, morally corrupt narcissists, the lot of them. And it's a script as old as humanity itself. We've always seen the town on the other side of the hill or the other country near us as the stupidest. Tribalists don't just become deceived by their need to demonize the outgroup, but even more so by their need to fit in with the in-group. They can become trapped purity spirals, competing with their own allies to show devotion to the tribe's principles. Whether you look at ancient Indians cutting off a finger at the knuckle to show their devout belief in their god, or a modern influencer who has increasingly outrageous ideology that gets rewarded for that online. Dr. Jonathan Haidt said that social media has turned our political discourse into a performance, where the goal is not to persuade, but to signal virtue to our own tribe. The irony here is, of course, every tribe believes that they are the ones thinking clearly, whilst all other tribes are stupid NPCs. In reality, tribal thinking is the oldest NPC script there is, and an automation so deep that we can basically mistake it for consciousness itself. And lastly, we have the Averager type NPC. The Averager is likely someone who is against conflict and not prone to strong emotions. Of all the NPC types, the Averager appears at first glance to be the most thoughtful. After all, doesn't truth often lie somewhere between the extremes? The middle ground is usually the wisest position. The Averager here has transformed this wisdom into something less profound though. They just have an automated response to complexity. They always compromise. If they're faced with a polarizing issue, whether it's economic policy, social issues, even dietary advice, their brain follows a predictable pattern. Instead of analyzing the merits of competing arguments, they instinctively just calculate the mathematical midpoint between them. When you look at brain imaging of an Averager's thought pattern, when they encounter strong positions on any topic, their anterior cingulate cortex, that's the part associated with the conflict resolution that I mentioned, well, that shows increased activity. However, the areas linked to conviction and strong belief actually decrease in activity. So they think about stuff, but they don't come to strong opinions, and that's not really wisdom, it's just automated conflict avoidance. And you can really see it in their language. I'll say things like, both sides have valid points. The truth is somewhere in the middle. Everyone is a little bit right and a little bit wrong, or the answer lies in finding balance. Now, these phrases sound reasonable, but they emerge regardless of the context, regardless of evidence, and regardless of the actual merits of different positions. It's like having a GPS that presented with any two routes automatically suggests the middle path, even if that path leads through a lake. It is literally misguided. A really telling sign of an Averager is their reaction to progress. When any group pushes for a significant change, the Averager instinctively adopts a yes, but position, not because they've analyzed the pros and cons, but because moderation itself has become their automated response. As Gurwinder says in his NPC article, the Averager can signal intelligence while sparing themselves the need for any. Let's say one party thinks homosexuality should be illegal and enforced with the death penalty, whilst the other side says that homosexuals should be free to do what they want and maybe even get married. I don't believe a line down the middle would have been a good solution to this. Sometimes you should have a strong opinion, and just averaging isn't always the right thing. Another really telling sign of an Averager isn't just the positions that they hold, but often their pride in not taking positions. They view sitting on the fence not as a bug, but as a feature. They mistake their automated moderation for sophisticated thinking. And there are some benefits. They are the least prone to extremism, which is great, but they are also the least principled people. And in their efforts to transcend bias, they've simply created a new one, the bias of the middle. And I think it's important to note that sometimes genuinely critical thinking does sometimes require taking strong positions. Truth doesn't always lie in the middle. Sometimes it is firmly on one side or the other. Now that we have covered the 5 types of NPCs, I'm sure that you should relate to at least one or some of them, and don't be offended by that. We all have some NPC thinking in our life. If you don't relate to any of them, I would actually be worried. And I'd probably say you are almost certainly the contrarian. For myself, as a biology and psychology student, I was naturally a left-leaning scientist, which aligns itself with a lot of the conformist type NPC. I also sometimes could be a bit of an averager, and there is definitely the odd opinion where I have deferred to people I assumed are smarter than me. And it is okay to have some NPC behavior. I'll quote Gurwinder here. The average lifespan of 80 years is just 4,000 weeks. You will have spent many of them already. Then perhaps a third of whatever remains will be spent asleep. Then most of the rest will be spent working and living. That doesn't leave you much time to research or think about things you'll often instinctively offer your own opinion on. People become NPCs because knowledge is infinite and life is short. They rush into beliefs because their entire lives are a rush, but there is a better way to save time than speeding through life, and that is to prioritize. Ultimately, the real crime of NPCs is not that they cheat their way to forming beliefs, but that they feel the need to have such beliefs at all. Trying to form an opinion on everything leaves them no time to have an informed opinion on anything. Now, what he suggests is that we should have 3 levels of how we decide to think about issues. On the bottom level, there are things that you don't actually need to care about. They don't affect you and you can't do anything about them, so don't have an opinion. There's no difference if you do or don't know about it, so stop taking shortcuts. Take the fastest route at all, which is no opinion at all. Then there are the mid-level things. They maybe interest you, but they don't need to be exactly right. It's best to avoid NPC shortcuts and instead seek out some of the best advocates on both sides of the spectrum. Maybe use websites like Grounded News that can show both sides of an issue. And when you've listened to some different opinions, you can go with the ideas that feel the most convincing or different parts of different arguments that make the most sense to you. And then finally, you have the most important issues. You are determined to get these ones right. Now, here, you use the time that you saved not thinking about the bottom level to go deep on this top level and learn everything there is to know. You can create an idea document that we've spoken about before and really investigate with an open mind what is going on here. Read books from different sources, investigate the internet, listen to different podcasts, different people, different viewpoints, make sure you're getting data that's verifiable, science that is repeatable and not funded to prove a point. And when you start doing this, it'll really help you build your own autonomy and your own intelligence. Understandably, you can't ever fully turn off your autopilot brain, and you honestly don't want to, but you can reduce its bad effects. On low importance topics, be silent. On mid-level topics, be humble. And on primary issues, you should be passionate. There are some ways to help build some awareness for yourself and the 3 kinds of behaviors that you should be aiming to improve within yourself. Firstly, every time that you're about to share something, try and pause. Whether you want to express an opinion, make a decision, you should ask yourself to wait. Why am I doing this? If your answer includes, well, everyone else is, or because some guru said so, well, that's your autopilot brain thinking. Secondly, you want to do a bit of an audit of your opinions. Make a list of your strongest opinions, and for each one, write down why you believe them. Not why someone else believes it, not why it's trending, why you believe it. And that will help you understand why you think the things you do and which areas you should be working upon. And then thirdly, embracing confusion. You should really start to celebrate if you ever feel confused about something. Confusion means your autopilot brain isn't giving you an easy answer and that your thinking brain needs to boot up and come up with a solution, or that you can admit you don't know the answer. And that's a really healthy place to be. Remember, our goal isn't to eliminate automatic thinking, but to choose when to engage it. The true freedom from NPC thinking comes from not avoiding all scripts altogether, but from being aware which scripts you are running, when, and why. Okay. I think that is the main things we want to hit, and I'll give you a bit of a recap because we covered quite a lot today. We've learned that we have a lot of information coming our way, and we live in a world of abundant information, and it's a lot for us to process. And so we rely on heuristics to come up with many of our own opinions and beliefs. And this is ingrained through millions of years of evolution. That's resulted in 5 main types of NPC that we see in the modern day. The conformist, who follows the main crowd. The contrarian, who always goes the opposite and can get a little bit conspiratorial. The disciple, who follows a preferred thought leader. The tribalist, who will stick to the group's decisions. And then finally, the averager, who will rely on simply dividing a hot topic in 2. Instead, what you want to do is to simply not have opinions where they don't matter and form your own personal, strong opinions when it does matter. The goal of understanding the NPC patterns in human behavior isn't about achieving some impossible state of constant conscious thought. It's about making strategic choices about where to invest your limited cognitive resources. You can't think deeply about everything, and you shouldn't try. Instead, just be conscious about your automated patterns, try to choose carefully what deserves your deeper attention, and get comfortable with saying, I just don't know the answer to everything else. Research has proven time and again that people who consciously limit their domains of expertise will actually make much better decisions within those domains, whether that's picking stocks or farming crops or making political decisions. They preserve their cognitive resources for what matters most whilst avoiding the pitfall of shallow opinions about everything. In a world of infinite information and finite attention, the truly independent thinker isn't someone who thinks deeply about everything, but someone who chooses wisely what to think deeply about. All right, if you know someone who you see forming opinions on things they shouldn't be, send them this episode and tell them how stupid they are. Of course, a lot less things matter than we think that they do, and a lot of topics are more political than they should be. It is a jungle out there, so please stay safe. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.